10th of March 1968, northern Quảng Trị Province, just below the DMZ. Dawn crawled up slow and colorless, a low ceiling of cloud pressing down on the jungle like a hand over a struggling mouth. The red dirt track that Marines called Route Blue 3 had already turned to paste under the night's rain, every bootstep lifting with a wet, sucking sound, every movement leaving a smear that said exactly where they'd been. The man who would spend the next 4 hours hunting invisible rifles with a broken one of his own was already soaked in sweat before the first shot cracked. Lance Corporal Thomas "Tom" Kincaid, 3rd Platoon, Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, moved in the staggered column with his M14 snugged into his shoulder, its familiar weight pressing into his collarbone through the clammy fabric of his jungle utilities. He was 21, from a small town in Indiana where the flat fields went on forever and the loudest thing in the evening was a distant tractor or a barking dog. Here, in the northern I-Corps, the loudest things were usually mortars, jets, and the sudden flat crack of a high-velocity rifle that meant someone you knew had just had the back of his head taken off. He moved a few men back from point on the left side of the column, eyes never quite leaving the tree line that ran parallel to the road. Route Blue 3 curved ahead in a shallow S, a reddish-brown scar through jungle so thick it seemed to grow back behind you. Radio wire hissed softly against web gear, canteens tapped against flak plates. Somewhere behind him, a man coughed once and then stifled it, as if even the air might be listening. The M14 on his shoulder looked like every other battered Marine rifle in country, wood swollen from humidity, Parkerized steel dulled by sweat and grime, but it carried its own private wound. 2 weeks earlier, under mortar fire at a fire base west of Jongha, Tom had bailed off the tailgate of a deuce and a half and landed wrong. The rifle slammed sideways into a rock. The stock had taken the blow. At first, it was just a dirty scrape. Only later, under red lens flashlight, had he seen the thin, jagged crack running from the magazine well toward the butt, like a fault line under brown varnish. He'd done what he was supposed to do, reported it. The armorer had checked headspace, run a test string into a drum of sand, and given the shrug of a man who had more broken guns than replacements. "Shoot straight, Marine. You want a perfect rifle? You picked the wrong war." There were more firefights than airlifts and more bodies than crates. Tom had walked out with the same rifle and a new awareness of every creak in the stock whenever he worked the bolt. If you only looked at Lima Company on paper, there was nothing special about them that morning. One platoon sweeping a stretch of road that intelligence insisted the NVA was starting to treat like a shooting gallery. The Battalion S2 at Firebase Granite had pointed to grainy OV-10 photos and grease pencil circles on the map, suspected trails feeding into the road, likely firing points on the slopes, probable marksman hides at the bends. Somewhere out there, they'd been told, a North Vietnamese marksman platoon from 324B Division was learning the terrain, testing angles, teaching every driver and rifleman on Blue 3 to duck. In the bunker, the air had felt almost thick with cigarette smoke and tension. A battered metal fan pushed hot air from one corner to another without cooling anything. The map table was cluttered with grease pencils, coffee cups, and a half-eaten can of peaches someone had abandoned when the briefing started. Young radio operators hunched over their sets along the back wall, pretending not to listen too closely, while pretending not to worry. "Sharpshooter elements will be operating in pairs and trios," the S2 had said, tapping little X's along the contours. "Expect coordinated fires, overlapping sectors, pre-sighted ranges. They're not just harassing, they're shaping. They want us to treat this road like a haunted house." Morales had stood with his helmet under one arm, jaw working a stick of gum that had lost its flavor an hour earlier. "So we go in, scare the ghosts, smash their furniture, and come home," he'd said. No one laughed, but the line hung there, something to grab onto. To the Marines on the ground, the briefing had distilled into something simpler. There were ghosts in the trees who liked to aim for helmets and medics. That was enough. Staff Sergeant Morales, the platoon sergeant, walked a little ahead of Tom on the same side, a compact block of muscle and bad coffee with a radio handset clipped to his harness. Without looking back, he said, low and conversational, "You tracking that 9 o'clock, Kincaid? Feels like the world's staring at us today." "Tracking," Tom answered. He slid the rifle into the pocket of his shoulder, thumb resting alongside the safety, not on it. The left side jungle was a wall of damp green, bamboo, elephant grass, trunks furred with moss. He didn't look for shapes. He looked for shapes that shouldn't be there. 2 straight lines, a hollow darker than it ought to be. A fern bent the wrong way. 20 minutes earlier, inside Granite's command bunker, the day had looked almost neat. Maps, grease pencil, coffee rings. Captain Hargrove had tapped Route Blue 3 with a chewed fingernail. They've hit convoys here and here, mortars, then single shots from the slope. No confirmed kills, but they're getting bolder. S2 thinks we've got trained marksmen up there, not some farmer with an SKS. The battalion intel officer had slid the photos over, talking about sapper companies, sniper teams, patterns of fire. He'd also talked about the men they'd already lost on other roads, the driver who caught a round through the open window of a deuce and a half, the radio man hit in the throat while stringing wire, the platoon leader who'd stood up for half a second too long to point at a tree line. Each death had come from one clean shot. No warning, no second chance. Morales had just nodded and asked for freedom to move off the road if it turned ugly. Hargrove had given it with a warning about mines, booby traps, and "don't go cowboy." Artillery from Granite was on call. 2 phantoms at Jongha sat on strip alert if things go sideways. That was the phrase, sideways. Nobody in the bunker liked how easy it was to imagine what sideways looked like. Now that they were 3 clicks from the wire, sideways felt close enough to touch. The air smelled of wet earth and mildew, and that faint iron smell that never quite washed out of a battlefield, even years after the last shell. Rotors thumped somewhere to the north, CH-46 by the rhythm, but the overcast hid them. Every leaf they brushed dropped cold water down collars and onto the slick canvas of flak vests. The world was all shades of green and grey, and the red-brown mud they ground under boot. The first shot snapped the morning in half. It wasn't an AK burst or a panicked spray. It was one clean supersonic crack that arrived almost the same instant as the sound of impact up front. The point man, Anders, jerked as if yanked backward by a cable and pitched forward into the road. His helmet bounced once and skittered into the ditch. For a blink, the column hung in mid-step, brains catching up to ears. Then everything exploded into motion. "Sniper! Down, down, down!" Morales bellowed, already diving for the left ditch. Marines vanished into mud and brush, cursing, gasping, packs ripping at their shoulders. Metal clanged. Someone screamed Anders' name. Tom hit the deck facing the left side of the road, body already turning toward where his instincts pointed. Mud slapped his cheek, water filled his nose, and the spaces between his fingers on the handguard. Through the ghost ring and front sight post, the jungle became geometry and guesswork. There was no second shot. Whoever was up there had discipline. Fire once, watch, wait for the medic or the leader or the idiot who tried to drag a friend out standing up. Tom could feel, almost physically, the attention focused on that road from somewhere up the slope. It was like being in the crosshairs himself. He let the shouting and radio calls blur into background noise. Granite's Fire Direction Center wanted numbers and grids. Morales gave them. Tom listened for something smaller, a fern frond twitching the wrong way, a puff of mist where a raindrop vanished, the echo that wasn't an echo. Doc Miller low-crawled toward Anders, Rizzo alongside him, both men trying to make themselves flat as snakes. The corpsman's bag snagged on a root. He yanked it free and kept going. When he reached for Anders' collar, the second shot came. Same flat surgical crack, same sudden violence. The round punched into Doc's upper arm and tumbled him sideways into the mud. He yelled once, more in anger than pain. Rizzo grabbed both men by their straps and dragged, boots churning sludge. Tom didn't see muzzle flash, but he saw what the bullet did to the world on its way through. A little spurt of vapor near a specific patch of tree root, a fern that snapped flat where nothing had touched it. The brain that had once translated broken cornstalks into the shape of a groundhog did its work. He keyed his throat mic. Morales, Kincaid, shooters left side, about 30 degrees off our axis, 75 to 80 meters, low on the slope, probably dug in. Copy, Morales rasped. All elements, pour it on that bearing, don't bunch up. M16s chattered, the M60 burped, tracers reaching into the green. Tom joined in with 2 fast shots, not because he thought he'd hit yet, but because bullets were probes as much as weapons. The jungle reacted, shredded leaves and clods of earth leaping under impact. An AK answered from somewhere further along the contour, 3-round burst, nervous. Then a third single crack, this time shaving bark off a tree above Rizzo's head and showering him in splinters. Multiple positions, a team, maybe more. Tom adjusted a hand's width up and right and waited. The world shrank to the ring and post circle over one particular patch of slope where the light seemed wrong. Then he saw it, a rectangle of blackness at the base of a buttress root, just a hair too straight, just a shade too regular. He exhaled and pressed the trigger. The M14 boomed, deeper than the M16's, the recoil pushing back into his collarbone. Through the sights, he watched the rectangle erupt into splinters and wet dirt. Something inside crumpled and slumped. "Got one," he said, surprised at how normal his voice sounded. "Copy one," Morales snapped. "Keep hunting. We're not moving till you start thinning that hill." Up on the slope, a North Vietnamese marksman, whose name Tom would never know, lay tangled behind his shattered slit, one eye still open, staring past the road. Around him, others shifted in their hides, the fight they'd thought they owned suddenly feeling less certain. The duel had begun in earnest, and somewhere deep in the walnut and steel pressed against Tom's cheek, the hairline crack waited for its moment. The sound of the second hit still hung in the damp air when the first artillery mission came down. Morales had gotten Granite's 105s on the line, voice clipped but steady, walking the fire along the upper slope where Tom's bearings pointed. The first shells arrived with the hollow, rushing whoop Marines called the incoming whisper, followed by concussions that punched the air out of your lungs if you were unlucky enough to be breathing in at the wrong moment. High on the ridge, trees toppled and dirt geysered. Clods of earth and leaves rained back down in a slow, dirty curtain. The artillery didn't kill all that much in that first salvo. Sniper teams built their hides to survive worse. But it did 2 crucial things. It shocked the NVA out of their perfect rhythm, and it carved fresh scars into the hillside that Tom could use. Explosions stripped away layers of foliage, leaving raw red earth and shattered roots. Against that new background, old camouflage looked suddenly wrong. Overlaps of netting, darker smears where a man had lain for hours, the squared-off cut of a log crib. It all stood out. The FO, a skinny lieutenant everyone called College, lay 2 Marines over from Tom, handset pressed to his ear, eyes flicking between the slope and his map. "Drop 50, fire for effect," he barked. Granite obliged. The hill shook again. Every time the barrage lifted, the jungle seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would move. Tom worked methodically. While one gun section in Granite reloaded, he scanned. When the next string of rounds slammed in, he shifted his focus a few meters over, catching how the shock wave rippled through brush and broke around solid shapes that weren't rock. He found the second hide by absence more than presence, a little pocket just below a blasted-out tree, exactly where a competent marksman would lie to cover the center of the road while letting his partner watch the far end. It was too smooth, too clean, protected from falling debris in a way nature didn't bother with. He put 2 rounds into the pocket. The third he saved, watching. On the second, something jerked. A flicker of movement, then stillness. 2, he said. Word spread along the column in fragments. Kincaid's got 2 of them already. He's picking their hides apart. Fear, which a moment ago had tasted like copper and bile, thinned into something else, wary belief. Men still hugged the mud, but their eyes tracked the slope with a little less helplessness. The NVA adjusted. They always did. Fire shifted further along the ridge, single shots now coming from higher angles, probing for helmets and elbows that peeked out where Marines thought they were safe. One round snapped so close past Tom's ear that the shock left it ringing, a flat tone that sat on top of all other sound. He ignored it. Ears were for later, eyes were now. The M14 cycled smooth as he shot, the cracked stock flexing in ways only he could feel. Somewhere under the butt plate a fibre was giving up, a whisper of separation that hadn't been there weeks before. Every time he reloaded, he glanced at the line that ran through the wood. It hadn't opened yet. It would. He just didn't know when. Minutes stretched into an hour. Rain eased to mist. The column became a line of shallow fighting positions along the ditches, helmets barely visible, rifles poking through ferns and culverts. Doc Miller, bandaged and cursing, worked one-handed down the line, checking pupils, cinching dressings, telling men they were fine even when they weren't sure. Tom lost track of how many times the hill spoke to him. A darker fold of earth, the faint flash of glass, when a scope caught stray light, the way birds spooked from one patch of canopy when they ignored another. Each time he adjusted a few mils, breathed, and let the M14 do what it was built to do. Each time another slit went dark. By mid-morning, the sharpshooters changed tactics. Instead of firing straight down into the road, they began angling shots across it, trying to catch Marines ricocheting instinctively toward cover. One round tracked so low it chewed a furrow along the dirt between Tom's boots. In its wake, he saw exactly where it had come from, an offset hole cut behind a fallen log on the opposite side of the hill, designed to catch anyone who thought the main threat was always from the same direction. He rolled, dragged himself 2 body lengths through the muck, and set up on a new angle. The firing slit was invisible from where he'd been. From here it was obvious, a horizontal line of shadow under the log that didn't match the curve of the ground. He put a single round through it. A rifle clattered down slope a heartbeat later, tumbling end over end. 3, he said. Granite's guns fell silent for a while as higher headquarters shuffled fire missions. The brief pause belonged to the rifles. The hill turned into a chessboard where every move cost blood. A Marine shifted an inch to see around a root, and a shot snapped over his knuckles. An NVA spotter leaned a hair too far forward to adjust his scope cap, and Tom's round found the notch of his collarbone. Morales crawled up beside him long enough to clap a muddy hand on his shoulder. "Keep stacking 'em, Kincaid. The faster they die, the faster we're off this road." "Roger, Staff Sergeant," Tom said, and eased back into the sights. The rifle finally protested on what he'd remember as his 7th confirmed hide. He'd seen the nest from the corner of his eye, a little built-up crib of logs behind a vine-draped tree that had seemed normal until the 3rd or 4th glance. The shot angle lined perfectly with the gouge on a steel pot 2 men down the line. He checked wind, which in the still damp air meant watching how smoke drifted from a spent artillery shell on the slope, and took his shot. The M14 kicked, the bolt slammed rearward, and then, as it drove forward, Tom felt the stock flex in his hands in a way it never had. The crack along the underside opened a fraction, just enough that he felt the halves shift. The bolt still went into battery, but the whole weapon felt looser, as if the steel and wood had stopped agreeing on where they were supposed to sit. He risked a glance. A thin, pale line had opened in the dark walnut, running just behind the magazine well toward the butt. It looked like a tiny, smiling mouth. "Don't you quit on me now," he muttered. The next round chambered. The rifle still fired straight enough. On the slope, another shadow stopped moving. 7. By late morning, the ambush corridor that had seemed so perfectly designed from the NVA perspective looked through Tom's aching eyes like a crime scene that refused to stop expanding. Each hide he killed revealed another angle, another overlapping field of fire, another length of communication trench that snaked behind roots and boulders, tying the whole lethal web together. Morales got permission from Hargrove to push a squad off the road and up the gentler part of the slope, using Tom like a pointer dog. They didn't go far, just far enough to clear the near crest and deny the sharpshooters' perfect plunging shots. Every meter off the road felt like stepping into a minefield, but staying put meant waiting to die. Tom moved with the lead fire team, the M14 tucked tight, feeling every tiny complaint from the wounded stock. The forest floor upslope was a mess of roots, old shell holes and cleverly disguised pits. Twice they found punji stakes under thin mats of leaves. Twice someone muttered thanks that a probe stick had gone ahead of a boot. The dead sharpshooters they reached were neat, compact men with weathered faces and quiet gear. No extra straps, no jangling metal. Their rifles were a mix of SKSs with locally made scope mounts, long Mosins with cut-down stocks, and a single captured M40 with a cracked unertel still bolted on. Sandbags filled their firing niches. Little niches hacked into roots held spare ammo wrapped in oiled rags. They had expected to work this hill for weeks. "Looks like they brought their A-team," Rizzo said under his breath. "Hell of a day to be special." Tom said nothing. He took what he needed from the hides. Information. From each position he saw where the next one would have to be to cover it. From trenches he traced where a leader would sit to see the whole pattern. Every answer begged another question. The M14 grew worse. After each magazine, the stock gap widened a hair. Under recoil, the barrel shifted just enough that groups at 75 meters began to open from fist-sized to dinner plate, then bigger. For most Marines in most fights, that would still be good enough for government work. For what Tom was doing, threading rounds into fist-sized holes in the jungle, it was the edge of failure. He adapted. He started bracing the forend against roots in specific ways, torquing the rifle ever so slightly to keep the sights returning to the same place after each shot. He learned exactly how much pressure he could put on the cracked stock before the point of impact walked off target. In a weird way, the broken rifle became more personal. It wasn't an interchangeable piece of government property anymore. It was a wounded partner he had to handle just right. On their 9th hide, he missed. It wasn't a wild shot. The round landed just low, chewing into the lip of the slit instead of the eye that watched behind it. The NVA shooter flinched back, then reacted the way good marksmen did. He shifted laterally, deeper into his crib, and fired back along Tom's muzzle flash. The return round hit a tree trunk inches from Tom's face, showering him in bark and sap. His left cheek stung where a sliver caught skin. Morales swore and yanked him down by his harness. "You good?" the staff sergeant demanded. "Yeah," Tom said, though his ears rang and his heartbeat felt like it was trying to climb out of his throat. "Then take the shot again. He knows you now. Don't give him a third try." Tom swallowed, rolled to a slightly different angle, and adjusted his aim a full hand higher to account for the barrel's flex. He exhaled, felt the cracked stock settle into his palm just so, and fired. This time the rectangle jerked, then sagged. A booted foot slid into view as the body inside lost tension. "9," he said softly. They found the command bunker not long after, a dugout chamber roofed with logs and dirt, half collapsed from granite shells, its entrance still marked by faint boot tracks and the stub of a cigarette ground out in the mud. Inside, scattered among maps and a field telephone with its cord snapped, were hand-sketched range cards. Little arcs drawn over crude outlines of the road, each marked with distances and notes in tight Vietnamese script. Someone had written Route Blue 3 in English at the top of one card. Someone had cared enough about this stretch of dirt to give it a name in the enemy's language. Morales held the card next to a US map for a moment, comparing arcs. "You were sitting right here when you took out number 4, he said, stabbing a finger at a mark. "They had you dialed, and you still outshot them." Tom barely heard him. The card made the hill make sense in a way no briefing had. Each little arc he'd felt as a bullet passing too close now had a line drawn on paper. It was like looking down at a maze he'd wandered blind and realizing he'd walked the only safe path through it without ever seeing the walls. By early afternoon, the firing dwindled. Not because the NVA had run out of rifles, but because every time a new position spoke, Tom found it and silenced it within a few exchanges. The sharpshooter platoon that had set out to make Route Blue 3 a killing ground found itself in something they hadn't planned for, a duel they were losing. The last serious attempt to break the stalemate came from higher up the ridge, where a secondary cluster of hides overlooked the whole slope from a different angle. Two marksmen there waited longer between shots, choosing targets carefully, testing whether the American with the heavy rifle was as good at reading the far edge of his vision as he was the near. They were good. They clipped a radio antenna, tore through a pack frame, punched a hole in the metal of an M60's receiver cover without hitting the gunner beneath. Men ducked lower. Morales nearly called for another artillery mission. Tom stopped him. "Give me a minute," he said. "Just one." "They're watching for it." He lay still, face pressed into a damp mat of leaves, and let the hill talk. He watched which birds settled where, which branches moved when there was no wind. He caught the tiniest wink of reflection, 2 degrees off from where everyone else's eyes were drawn, and knew, just knew, that the scope lens that made it had to be there, because nowhere else on that slope would an NVA sniper risk that angle. He fired, the M14 groaning in his hands like an old ship in a storm. The return shot never came. The partner tried once more from a backup hole and died on the second exchange. When the shooting finally stopped altogether, the jungle fell into a thick, stunned quiet. No more single cracks, no more probing rounds. Just the drip of water, the distant cough of an artillery tube miles away, and the ragged breathing of Marines who'd been flat on their bellies for hours. "How many, Kincaid?" Morales asked at last. Tom wiped sweat and rain and sap from his cheek with the back of his hand. He didn't want to say it, because it sounded like a lie even inside his head. But he counted the hides they'd cleared, the bodies they'd stepped around, the rifles they'd kicked aside. 16 positions, he said. Some doubles, some had spotters, but 16 real hides at least. Morales let out a low whistle. Rizzo, overhearing, muttered "Jesus Christ" under his breath, not quite as a prayer. On the hill, NVA survivors pulled back along trenches and game trails, dragging what they could, leaving what they couldn't. Somewhere among them, a leader did his own math and realized that a single American rifleman with a damaged weapon had just unstitched an entire carefully prepared kill zone in a matter of hours. They didn't turn Route Blue 3 into a victory parade. They just got off it alive. By mid-afternoon, Granite's CO ordered Lima back to the firebase. No one was eager to argue. The platoon moved in staggered bounds, leapfrogging cover to cover, waiting for a last spiteful shot that never came. The road still felt cursed, but quieter now, like a stage after the actors have left and only the set remains. Tom walked near the middle this time, the M14 carried at low ready. The crack in the stock had widened enough that he could slide the edge of a dog tag into it. Every step made the halves creak faintly. Passing the spot where Anders had gone down, men glanced without meaning to. Someone righted the fallen helmet and set it carefully on a broken stump, a small, unofficial marker. Doc, pale with pain and blood loss, rode back on a resupply jeep, arm in a sling, and boots still caked with the mud of the ditch he'd bled in. Back inside the wire, the world snapped back into something that looked from the outside like normal. Men dropped their packs, drank warm water, lit smokes with shaky hands. The gun crews at the 105s cleaned breeches and stacked powder bags for the next fire mission that had nothing to do with Blue 3. Radios chattered about other patrols, other grids, other fights. In the platoon's corner of the perimeter, Morales dropped onto an ammo crate and finally let the tension leak out of his shoulders. "Head count," he said. They'd lost Anders. Doc Miller would keep his arm, but never fully trust it again. A couple more guys had grooves in their helmets or cuts on their faces where bark and rock fragments had tried to finish what bullets started. It could have been much worse. Hargrove came down from the CP an hour later, helmet off, hair plastered with sweat. He listened to Morales's brief, flipped through the scribbled notes the FO had made of fire missions, and then turned to Tom. "That true?" he asked. 16 positions. Tom, sitting on an upturned sandbag with the M14 across his knees, shrugged once. 16 distinct hides we put eyes on, sir. Might have been some decoys. Might have been more that never got to fire. And your rifle?" Tom looked down at it. Up close in the clear light of afternoon, the damage was obvious. The stock was split almost from the magazine well to the buttplate, a thin canyon of pale wood showing through the dark stain. When he flexed his hand, the two halves shifted against each other with a tiny squeak. "Broke more every time I shot it," he said. "Still put rounds where they needed to go." Hargrove studied him for a long moment, then shook his head with a humorless little exhale. "I'll put you in for something," he said. "Don't know what yet. Intel's already salivating over what you guys found up there. That whole slope was a damn sniper schoolhouse. You tore it up." He left. The war moved on. Lima went out again the next day on a different road, because that's what units did. Blue 3 stayed quieter than anyone expected over the next few weeks. The NVA shifted their harassment elsewhere, burned by the lesson they'd paid for in blood on that hillside. Word about the fight spread in the sideways way of marine lore. A month later, a radio man from another company stuck his head into Lima's hooch and asked, "Hey, which one of you is the dude who whacked 16 of Charlie's best with a busted rifle?" Someone pointed at Tom. The story had already grown teeth by then. Some versions insisted he'd done it with iron sights at 500 meters in the rain. Others had him single-handedly leading a charge up the hill like something out of a John Wayne flick. Tom always corrected the details when he could. He hadn't been alone. Morales, Rizzo, Doc, the gun bunnies back at Granite, they'd all been part of that morning's narrow escape. And his shots hadn't been magic. They'd been the sum of a farm kid's eye, too many firefights, and a rifle he knew better than he knew most people. The armorer finally took the M14 away a week later. He turned it over in his hands, whistled and said, "Hell, Kincaid, you've been trying to break this thing on purpose." The crack had loosened to the point where the action wobbled in the stock. Tom felt strangely naked when the weapon left his hands. The replacement he got, a fresher M14 with tight wood and crisp metal, shot fine at the range. It just didn't feel like the same conversation. The after-action report that went up the chain turned the day into lines and bullets on a page. Pult received accurate sustained sniper fire from NVA marksman platoon vicinity route Blue 3. 1 KIA, multiple WIA, enemy sniper capability significantly degraded. 16 firing positions destroyed or abandoned. Recommend increased patrol presence along MSR, continued use of counter-sniper assets. It didn't mention mud down the back of your neck, or the way your stomach clenched every time a single shot cut through the air. Years after the war, in bars and VFW halls and on the back porches of houses in towns that looked a lot like the one he'd left, men would ask him about Vietnam. Some wanted to hear about the big stuff, Khe Sanh, Hue, Tet. Tom hadn't been in those. His stories were smaller, patrols, hills, a road with a name only Marines and mapmakers remembered. He learned quickly that most people didn't really want the weight of it. They wanted a shape they recognized, something with a beginning, middle and end, with clear heroes and villains and a punchline they could toast. When he mentioned the smell of wet canvas or the way jungle mud sucked at your boots so hard it felt personal, their eyes sometimes glazed. When he said snipers, they perked up again. Everyone understood the idea of an invisible shooter. Not many understood what it meant to spend 4 hours knowing that any square inch of your body that rose too high might be the one that drew fire. On the rare nights when he tried to give them the details, the ringing in one ear that never quite went away, the way he still sometimes flinched when a car backfired in a parking lot, he usually ended up changing the subject halfway through. Sometimes, when the question came from someone who seemed to actually want the truth and not a movie, he'd tell the Route Blue 3 story. He never led with the number. He talked about mud and fear, and how quiet the jungle got between shots, how the world shrank to a circle of steel and wood against his cheek, and the small decisions of when to breathe and when to squeeze. If they pressed, he'd mention that there had been a lot of hides up there and that he'd gotten more than his share. Once in a while, someone would ask about the rifle, almost as an afterthought. Broken M14, right? How's that even work? He'd smile a little then, because that part he could explain. He'd talk about stocks and bedding, and how a rifle that had lived on your shoulder long enough stopped being a tool and started being a language. He'd explain how you could feel when it wanted to throw a shot high or left, how you could bully it back into line with the way you wrapped your hand or dug the butt into your collarbone. Most people listened politely and then said something like, "Still, 16, hell of a thing." If they said 16, no way, he'd just shrug. "Depends how you count," he'd say. "They built a lot of places to kill us from. We just didn't let them use most of them." It sounded less like bragging when he put it that way and more like what it had been. Two groups of tired, scared men trying very hard to make sure the other side ran out of options first. On the other side of the old DMZ, in villages that had once fed the 324B Division, veterans told their own version. They spoke of a day when their best sharpshooters went up against a single American with a heavy rifle that refused to break. They talked about how, no matter how carefully they had dug their holes and sighted their lines, every muzzle that spoke drew an answer, and how one section of the hill became a graveyard of their most patient men. In some tellings, the American had been everywhere at once, appearing at different points along the slope as if he could walk through trees. In others, he never moved at all, just lay in the mud like a stone while his bullets hunted anyone who dared expose an eye. Time and retelling rounded the rough edges, turned confusion into choreography. Men who had been there knew better. They remembered the frustration of watching carefully plotted firing lanes fall silent one by one, and the sick certainty that staying meant dying. Some of them swore the Marine had been using captured NVA weapons, or that he'd had a scope that could see through leaves, or that artillery had done most of the work. Memory is kind to pride that way. But in the quieter moments, when they spoke only among themselves, a few admitted that whoever had been behind that M14 had turned their perfect textbook ambush into a lesson in humility. The war moved on. Units rotated. Roads got new names or disappeared back under jungle. But for one morning in 1968, on a muddy stretch of Route Blue 3, 16 carefully prepared firing positions had gone silent under the aim of a single man whose rifle was, by any sensible measure, already broken. And that was what stuck with both sides. Not that he'd been superhuman, but that he'd been just human enough to feel the fear and the doubt and the give in the stock, and then press the trigger anyway, again and again, until the hill stopped shooting back.